Today's episode is brought to you by MRC, a branding studio hailing out of Raleigh, North Carolina, where they focus on crafting killer design work for clients that love uber creative solutions for companies small and large. You can find and connect with them online at mrcraleigh.com. That's MRCRALEIGH, and at MRC Raleigh on Instagram. The good news is, if you find yourself reaching out, you'll most likely get to chat with yours truly. That's right, it's My Little Branding Co., and we're here to make your brand or idea look amazing. So let's connect.
The world is always going to tell you no, right? Like, the world does not want you. And you can't have sore feelings over that, right? Like, that's just the world, and that's how the world is. And so you can't stop. If you are great, you can't stop. And if you suck, you can't stop. Like, the only way to get better is to not stop and don't take no. You may have a horrible life as a result of this advice. Like, you may be terrible at it for decades, but it's the only way you're going to get better. Like, quitting is not the answer.
Recorded at the Kitchen Studios. This is the Pencil Pushers Podcast.
Welcome, Leadheads, to another fine episode of the Pencil Pushers Podcast. As always, I'm your humble host, Mike Rosado. And today I present my chat with comic artist, Rice University professor, and author, Christopher Sperandio. Chris started from humble beginnings, living in rural West Virginia, to carving a deep niche in the pop art world, spanning comics, games, museum exhibitions, sculptures, installations, and television productions all around the world. Chris shares his love of creative collage-style comics, the importance of taking art and comics seriously, and great advice on being the best and most authentic artist you can be, even if that means sometimes getting the occasional death threat. I'm taking a bet that this is the perfect episode for you. So sit back, relax, and enjoy our chat with Chris. Listeners, we are here with Chris Sperandio. Chris is a graphic artist, comics creator, historian. He's also an associate professor at Rice University and director of comic art teaching. He's also the author of several books that we'll talk about in the conversation ahead, including Fundamental Camarena, Pinko Joe, Greenie Josephini, comics making, and others that we'll get into along the way. Anyway, it's great to have you, Chris. Welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. I understand that it's that you've got spring break, so you got a little bit of downtime from your work as a professor at Rice University, huh?
Yeah, so I can work on my beach body and tan, and yeah.
It looks like it's coming together, man.
Spring break stuff. Yeah,
I was perusing on Instagram as we do these days, and ran into some of your work and just absolutely fell in love with it. In fact, a lot of the stuff that you've been doing recently was in reaction to the Ukrainian struggle that's happening right now with Russia invading them. And I was very, not only floored by the technique itself, but of course, feeling your sense of urgency and the execution of how you are using your art to basically use your voice in how you feel about what's going on right now, not only with this particular scene that's happening in the Ukraine, but also just around the world. So using politics as and comics, combining those two, I thought was very compelling. And anyway, I just thought that it was just beautifully done, not only technique wise, but also really spoke to my heart as I guess you could call a semi-political activist, somebody who really cares about the world, and also an artist myself. So it's really cool to see that. So that's why I reached out and I was like, we got to talk to this guy.
Well, it's not working though.
Right.
I mean, we didn't talk about bad language in the pre-meeting meeting.
We can go for it,
What's
man.
your bad language?
We're all adults here.
That Vladimir Putin is a motherfucker. and somebody needs to punch his ticket.
Yeah.
Yeah, but comics, it's not. I don't think it's not stopping the bombs.
Yeah.
It's frustrating. You speak out. I got a death threat from a Russian.
Did you?
Yeah. I guess it's been 10 days or so now, but they just shut Instagram down in Russia, so that'll stop those death threats.
I have a friend who is a personal trainer who's from Russia, and she said like the tiniest little bit of support on her Instagram for the Ukrainians. I mean, it was the most subtle thing you could possibly do. You'd have to like think about it a little bit to see that she was still, pretty much rooting for the Ukrainians, right?
Yeah.
And she basically had her account frozen, so she's having trouble with being able to use Instagram as her main mode of like getting business for her personal training business. So it's pretty crazy. So was that person that was giving you a death threat, were they in the United States? Do you have any idea what the scenario was?
No, they were based in Moscow. I looked at their Instagram account pretty closely and took some screenshots before I blocked them. But muscly tattooed guy in front of a Confederate flag in a coffee bar in Moscow. It's just
perfect.
Just kind of surprising, really.
Yeah. And
I quickly blocked them, and maybe that'll be the end of it. I get the occasional death threat because of what I'm doing, and like I kind of enjoy getting death threats. I like it.
And it's interesting too. I mean, I want to get into this a little bit further into the conversation, but I do find it really interesting, and I want to dig into even just you as clearly being of the sort of progressive. Liberal, I would say, is like sort of a bad word, I guess, for the progressive-minded folk. Nature, and being a professor at a university in Texas, and where all those things cross, and if that's controversial at all. So I'm really excited to get into that. But before we do that, as I mentioned before we started pressing record, a lot of people are not going to know who you are on our, the listeners that are listening right now. So if you could just tell us a little bit about who you are, where comics became a part of your life, and where did that all start for you?
Yeah, so I was born in a small coal mining town in Appalachia.
Is that for real?
Yeah, that's for real. Yeah. And growing up, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and in the 70s, there was the only culture available to me was comic books that were on the comic book rack at the soda shop, or movies. We got 2 movies each week to our little cinema there in this small town.
What town was it?
And then
state?
A town called Kingwood. It's the county seat of Preston County in the state of West Virginia.
Okay.
It's about 90 miles south of Pittsburgh. So we got all the Pittsburgh stations. So we had 5 TV stations when I was growing up, which was, kind of amazing. All the 3
networks,
and then PBS. So it was, and then an independent channel. Anyway, so until I was 18, I'd never been inside a museum. And then I got a scholarship to go study art at West Virginia University, which was about 25 miles away.
It's a big school.
West Virginia, it's a good state university. Yeah. It's a land grant university. And I had some great teachers. I actually lucked out in that the faculty that was there when I was there actually sort of adopted me and taught me about not only contemporary art but art history, and I learned about drawing and printing and painting, and so it was a great education, and it just radically transformed my life. I went from having, of course, it doesn't make sense to be poor and studying art, right? Because it really is an all or nothing economy. You don't, if you fail as an artist, you basically die, right? I mean, you starve to death. Or,
Yes. Right.
Get rickets or something. So, so it wasn't the greatest idea, sort of in terms of like class mobility, to like study art.
Sure.
But,
was that basically?
I think,
I mean, did you go for it because you were just like incredibly passionate about it, or was it because, like many artists are, it was like the only thing that they were half good at? I mean, where were you standing on the spectrum there? I mean, it was just like, well, I guess I
can
draw.
be both. I can be both of those things. I was very passionate about the only thing that I was good at. Actually, I wanted to be a filmmaker, and all through high school, I had a Super 8 film camera with an audio, with the sound, and I was always making film. Like as soon as I could afford another roll of film, I was out there making another movie, and I really wanted to be a director, but they didn't have that at West Virginia University, and there was no way to get to that. Mm-hmm. And so I accepted, well, I guess I'll just be an artist then.
Yeah.
And then
were you trying to be like were you basically, I'm just trying to get a feel for like what your culture was back then personally, like what you were surrounded by. I mean, were you were you like of the mind that was looking at all, the Brian De Palma, Francis Ford Coppola, were you in that sort of like realm, or were you like the sort of new
George
gen
Romero.
back then? Okay.
George Romero, Night of the Living Dead.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. More horror. Yeah. Gotcha.
Yeah. I wanted to direct, the Alien movie growing up was my favorite movie.
Okay.
I still love that fucking movie, but
that wasn't George Romero, right?
Yeah, that was what, Ridley Scott, right?
Ridley Scott, yeah.
Science fiction and horror. That was more science fiction than horror, but Night of the Living Dead really made an impression on me. That one really got me. So so I studied at WVU. I graduated, and then I went to Chicago. I went to grad school in Chicago to study art. And again,
Chicago Institute?
No, I went to University of Illinois in Chicago.
Okay.
I tried to get into the Art Institute twice and didn't make it either time. And then about 5 years later, they asked me to teach there.
Whoa.
Yeah, so a little revenge, like that's.
Was it true revenge where you just went like, no, I refuse, or did you take the job?
No, I took their money. Yeah. It was great. That was great. I think it's a good tip for your listeners who are interested in the arts and want to pursue the arts. The world is always going to tell you no, right? Like the world does not want you, and you can't have sore feelings over that, right? Like that's just the world, and that's how the world is. And so you can't stop. If you are great, you can't stop, and if you suck, you can't stop. Like the only way to get better is to not stop and don't take no. You may have a horrible life as a result of this advice. Like you may be terrible at it for decades, but it's the only way you're going to get better. Like quitting is not the answer.
Yeah, I mean, isn't that in some like if you know that ahead of time, if that's your long game strategy, I mean, at the end of the day, isn't that actually going to make your life a lot more fulfilling? If you're like, you know what, this is just my long term strategy, and so I know that there's going to be ups and downs, right?
Yeah. Well, most artists have a second job, right? I mean, I have a second job. I'm a professor at a university, and before I was that, I worked as a hack graphic designer for Chase Manhattan Bank in New York. And before that, I drove a truck. I drove a delivery truck in Chicago to put myself through grad school. Like unless if you come from money, then you don't have any problems.
Yeah. Right.
And if you don't come from money, then you have to work. And most people don't come from money. So, it's tragic in a way, but also, having a second job makes you a more interesting person.
Yeah. Yeah. Was the idea like, when you got out of, you got your master's degree, was the idea that teaching was going to be your mode of, having financial support? I mean, did you ever have in your mind that, now we haven't quite gotten there yet, but I mean, was the idea that you were going to get a job and then use that as a means to support your art from the beginning? Or was the hope that maybe I would get into being a filmmaker or, graphic artist, or, which direction was it for you in the beginning?
I am a terrible capitalist. Like, I wasn't thinking about anything practical. I just wanted more education, right? Like a BFA, a 4-year degree, it's not enough time to learn to be an artist, right? I see it in my students. At Rice we have a BA in art, and really they're only just starting to come into themselves in the final weeks of their last semester.
Yeah.
And in a BFA in art, like, you're still like, you're not fully cooked. Like, you gotta go out there and get cooked more. And so I took a year off and worked in Chicago I worked as a printer, I worked as a construction worker, and then I started working as a truck driver, and then I went to grad school. Then I got accepted, and it was terrific.
Nice.
It was the best thing I ever did.
Nice. So when did you start getting into actual comic book making, like, as a creator? I mean, when did that, like, seem like a possibility for you?
Well, I had my first year of college, my drawing teacher caught me reading a comic book, and he really chewed me out. He told me those things were garbage, and that I would never learn to draw as long as I continued to look at those things. And
wow.
So one thing that I did when I went to college, and it's probably the smartest thing I ever did, I made a conscious decision that I was going to listen to my teachers. I was going to do what they told me to do, and then later I would try to figure it out for myself. Like, does that still apply for me?
Smart move.
And so I literally, I wish my fucking students would do that. Just do what I tell you. And so I abandoned comics. Through undergrad and through graduate school. I learned about the Cubists, and I learned about Dada, and I learned all of the great movements of the 20th century, landing in sort of like expressionist painting with a neo-expressionism that was happening in the 80s.
Nice, yeah.
And that's what I went to grad school with. I was a neo-expressionist painter.
Oh, wow.
And I was good at it too. I was a good painter. Like, yeah. I think if I hadn't, some days I think, I should have stuck with the painting. Like, maybe that, because painters live a nice life. They listen to NPR, they daub around a little bit on a canvas,
right.
They take a drink of coffee.
Yeah.
Nobody's sending them death threats. You don't have to worry about some algorithm.
I don't know if that's true necessarily.
Well, but anyway, yeah. So, yeah. And so comics, I really only started to come back to comics after grad school. I began collaborating with a British artist named Simon Grennan, and we had started doing these things we called sort of socialized artworks. In other words, the art that I was trained in, the sort of high museum stuff, didn't really connect with my life in Chicago, riding the bus, standing and waiting for the bus. It seemed like a lot of my life in Chicago was about the fucking bus. And so I wanted to start making artwork that reflected my sort of normal life. And so comic books seemed like a really good way to do that, because comic books are very approachable. Comics, you can have sort of all these different form factors for a comic book, all these sort of narrative approaches. And so I began making comic books as artworks for museums.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's how that started. Okay.
Yeah, so all through the 90s, I made comic books with Grennan about other people. So these sort of biographical comics, and they were commissioned by some pretty big museums, like the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the Seattle Art Museum, the Institute of Contemporary Art in London, and then sort of the pinnacle was the Museum of Modern Art in New York.
So that's very interesting. So tell me a little bit about like where that interest came about, like actually doing comics for in support of past artists or people of interest to you, or even just maybe somehow wanting to expose them to a greater audience. Where did that all come about?
Well, so the comics were really not about the artists or the institutions. It was about the people sort of around the institutions. So, for example, the book that we did with DC Comics and the Museum of Modern Art was all about employees of the Museum of Modern Art and their lives. So, and that book was called Modern Masters. And so it was this sort of very sort of unusual sort of view of the museum. You know, when we go to a museum, we don't think about the people that work there necessarily, the guard that stands there day after day after day.
Yeah.
You know, we're not there to engage with the sort of infrastructure, the HR, museum human resources department. We're there to look at the Mona Lisa.
Yeah.
Or, you know, the Picasso or whatever. And so all of these comics that we did in the 90s and into the 2000s really were artworks for museums, but they were about people that were around the museum.
Interesting. And you did that for how long?
Yeah.
How long did you kind of go into that?
Well, we did that through we still do them on occasion. We still work together once in a while.
Yeah.
It's been decades, so it's less interesting now than it used to be.
Yeah.
But through the 90s we did them, and they were co-published by Fantagraphics Books.
Oh wow.
In Seattle. And then the book that we did with MoMA was with DC Comics. I was one of those kids. I would put a spider and a bee in a jar together, like hoping that they would fight. Like I wanted to, I wasn't killing animals. I just wanted to. Right. I wanted to see if they would get it. And of course, they just completely ignore each other. Right? They just walk around each other like they don't even exist.
Yeah.
And putting MoMA and DC together was really kind of the same impetus and same result.
Yeah.
Like they just didn't recognize each other.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
So were you doing this also while you were still being a professor? Yeah. Where did that all come together?
So I didn't start teaching until I was in my 40s. Like I did some guest stuff. Like I worked at the Art Institute, the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, but I was living in New York. They would fly me out once a month to meet with their students. And so I would do little bits of teaching, like a lecture here or a guest thing there. But I didn't really start teaching full time until like 2005.
Gotcha.
I got this endowed visiting professorship at Carnegie Mellon University. So I was there for 3 years, and then I came to Rice, and I've been at Rice since 2008.
And how do you feel about being? Obviously, teaching is a really formidable part of your career. I mean, how do you feel about being a teacher? Is it a means to an end, or do you find some sort of catharsis or sense of purpose doing that? Like, how do you sit?
I feel pretty strongly about teaching. Like there are other ways to make a living, right? And I've done them. Before I took the job at Carnegie Mellon, I was executive producer of a television series. I created a television series that ran for 2 seasons.
Wow.
Every
time I hear you talk a little bit more, I learn something new. I mean, you've sent me enough information. I'm learning new. Okay, keep going.
Yeah. Teaching feeds into I try not to draw a line between what I do as an artist and what I do as a teacher, except that I don't use curse words in front of my students because I just don't think it's appropriate. Mm-hmm. But on your podcast, on my Instagram,
let it roll. Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that research is part of what I do. Teaching helps me become a better communicator. Like I just think that I learn every day how to speak to people better, and how to connect with them better. Most of my students don't want to be artists. It's a lark for them.
Oh, really?
And I have a little trouble with that. That's the troubling aspect. Is I grew up like working class.
Yeah.
And have had to sort of struggle to keep to climb, right, to achieve. And so I don't like it when people treat what I do as some kind of fun hobby. It's not a fun hobby.
Yeah.
It's not fun, and it's serious. One of the first lectures I give to my students is I have a talk that I give about how studying comics is the most important thing you can do at Rice University or at any school. It's the entertainment industry is 7 times larger than the energy industry in the U.S. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
7 times. So, of course, comic books aren't all of that, right? We've got video games. Video games is probably the largest part of the sector. But still, a lot of video games are made from comic books, right?
Yeah.
Like comic books
and movies and TV shows now, of course.
Yeah. And so if we're going to be capitalists and measure things in dollar amounts, then comic books win, right? Like if we're going to talk about it that way. But also, I mean, look at the, the other aspect of being a comic book artist are death threats. If you're making political art, it's a really important field. And so I get a little pissy about people who just kind of stroll through my backyard. I don't like it.
What do you think about the fact that your students don't necessarily take it seriously when they see how serious and prolific you are as an artist, and how much weight you put into the subject matter you put out? I mean, it feels to me like when you hear about there is the idea live by example, and then people will follow. But yet again, you have students who basically look at probably like how they would look at their dad going, oh yeah, he does that thing, it's not that big of a deal. I mean, how do you feel? Why is that? Do you find that to be the case? Well,
I mean, all teaching is like you're planting seeds, right? And you don't know, like that seed doesn't spring up, this year. Maybe it springs up next year, right? Like there's a delayed effect between information going in and then somebody sort of realizing it. I'll get cards every once in a while from a student like, oh, I really enjoyed your class. I didn't appreciate it at the time, yada, yada. Those go up on my fridge. The like, you were right. 10 years later, you were right kind of cards. It's fine, I'm not in their shoes, so I try to treat everybody with the same sort of level of engagement.
Yeah.
And hope that at some point the light bulb will go off. I mean, it might be I'm a shitty teacher. That could always be one of the variables.
Let's talk a little bit about some of your books. So we've got, it's spanned from like educational. You've got some stuff that are just generally talking about like important figures in comic book history, like with this book here, Fundamental Camarena. You also talk about just the art of comic making in general. Seems like it's a little bit more educational from that perspective. But then you've also got the political aspect too, with like Pinko Joe, Pinko Joe, and Greenie Josephini. I want to talk about a little bit of the politics stuff. I mean, obviously, hearing a little bit about your background, you came from a blue collar town. Obviously, somebody who's pulled the sort of worker mentality into your work. It's obviously a part of your life, and you've utilized that in the work that you create. So how is it that you got into, number one, into actually publishing books that were very specific? And I don't mean this in a negative way, but I would say more on the sort of propaganda style type of publishing. And if you could walk us through that. And also I'm curious about how your relationship with the university, because I believe that they actually are assisting with some of the publishing. Am I wrong? So where does that
Rice University has a lot of money, and I've been there for 14 years, and I've kind of figured out where they hide it. So, it's in different pockets. They don't advertise where those pockets are. And, once I come across one of those pockets, then I kind of scoop out everything I can before I move on to the next one. I sound like a capuchin monkey or something. I don't know that anybody at the university has read any of my books. I think if it's offended somebody, I haven't heard about it.
Sure.
And generally, the feedback that I get from people is, "I love your book." Now, maybe there are people out there who hate my books, and they just don't have the guts to say it to my face.
The question fine. Every artist has on their mind every single day. The great thing about making the Pinko Joe and Greenie Josephini and the final volume is red, white, and you blew it all to hell. Is I really don't give a fuck what anybody thinks about those books. I made those books for me. Yeah.
And I think they're fucking perfect.
Yeah.
They're brilliant. They're exceptionally well made. They're hilarious. There's a laugh on every page. And if somebody out there buys my book and they don't fucking like it, they can send it back to me.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'll give them any money in return.
That's basically how it should be, anyways. But I am curious about the politics of it. How did you? What was the motive? I guess. I know you're making it for you, but clearly you've got to make multiple copies. You're not going to hoard them all on, and have one giant wall full of those books. You obviously want to get them out there.
Now, I am kind of like a dragon in that regard. I really don't like selling them or giving them. I've got stacks of them back here behind me. You can see.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I don't want anybody to have my books. I want them.
Maybe that's why you actually gave me two copies of one, so that might have something to do with it.
I didn't give you a Pinko Joe?
No, you did. You gave me two Pinko Joes, actually. And I also got a Greenie Josephini.
Why did I give you two?
I don't know.
Well, you're lucky you got any. Sell that extra one. Well, you could sell them all now, right? The university gave a lot of support to the project, I've got a great job, and so I really don't need to sell anything. And so that's a condition.
It's a great place to be.
It's kind of terrible though, because then you just make stuff for yourself, and maybe, if you were forced to make something and consider other people a little bit, you might make something that could be turned into a Netflix series.
Sure. I don't know. Pinko Joe has a very, very nice ring to it. It'd be interesting to find that as a Netflix series sometime in the future. Yeah.
Well, Netflix, if you're listening, you can buy it. I want.
You got terms and conditions ready to go?
Well, yeah, I want executive producer, and I want to be able to. I want a writing credit. Yeah, all that.
So let's talk a little bit about the technique, because I discovered, as I was reading it, talk to me about servicing. So you basically utilize artwork that's already existed in I think the way you described it is sort of like a collage style version of comic book producing, where you've equated it almost to like hip hop sampling as an example. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I've been looking at these. There are some great online resources for public domain comics where you can look at. There's something like 35,000 comic books in the public domain for one reason or another, and you can look at these all you want. You can download them because nobody owns them. They're for everyone. And I've been looking at those for like 10 years, trying to think like there's an idea here. Like I want to try to make this into something, make this into a work. And then I finally just got sick of sort of staring at it. And I took a story from one of these public domain comics and I stripped out all the lettering. I stripped out all the color so that there was just the line work from the original comic. So this sort of like slightly fractured, but kind of all there.
Okay.
And then I went the other direction with it. I started writing. So I come up with new sort of storyline and dialogue for this story, the 6-page story, and wrote it all. And then I lettered it and did the balloons. And then I went and I inked the whole thing.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Basically, I was the writer and the inker, and the pencils were from the original comic book artist.
Okay.
Right. So I kind of forced this collaboration. I went back in time before these things were inked, and I re-inked.
Wow.
And then I recolored everything.
Yeah. So are you mixing and matching? Are you in order to create the story, or is it literally like they're in sequence, on a board with all the different panels and everything like that, and you're figuring out how to tell your story in the sequence that they've created, or do you mix and match?
So when I started this, I set up a few rules for myself. Like I wanted to use entire stories in order to get them in order for one story to sort of seamlessly blend into the other. I had to, like the last panel in a story, in order to connect it to the next story,
sure,
but make it seamless, sometimes I would have to swap that panel out and come up with a different panel for that, just to like narratively to make that happen. So I kind of like stitch, right? Wow. So I would just stitch these stories together. And that was kind of the fun of it too, right? To take this like 6 or 8 page story about mobsters and turn it into part of this longer narrative about corporate bankers.
Yeah.
And so in making Pinko Joe, I did what I tell my students not to do, which is that I just started at the beginning and I went to the end. And by the time I got to the end, I kind of figured it all out. But by then it was too late. I'd made these 96 pages. So I had a choice. Do I stop and do I go back and start again?
Mm-hmm.
And now that I know how to do this, do it over.
Yeah.
Or do I keep going?
Yeah.
And I thought, keep going. So like in Pinko Joe, there's really no strong female protagonist. And that's because the source material that I was using
didn't have it.
Those comics from the 1950s, they just didn't have strong female protagonists. So at least I didn't find any. So for the second book, I had to really dig deep to find 1950s comics that had that strong female protagonist. And I found some. I didn't find enough. And then, and so then like I managed to end the thing in the third volume. It's a ridiculous way to work.
And so that's the one that is that one coming out now? It's red, white, and you blew it all to hell. Is that right?
Yeah.
And so that is that coming out soon?
It's on the press as we speak, and it should be out I'm hoping that I'll have it by the time TCAF, Toronto Comics Arts Festival, happens in June.
Gotcha. So just to dive in a little bit more on that process there. So if you felt like it needed to, like it was necessary in order to serve the storyline, I mean, you had all the pencils, you had all the penciled drawings there. You could easily go in and add new characters. Was that ever something that you would do, or you would fill in? You wouldn't do that, huh? Wow. Okay.
I did because that was the fun, right?
Yeah.
Like, how am I going to write myself out of this fucking corner?
Yeah.
and
so it's almost like cheating if you were to do that, right?
Yeah, I mean, I had these kind of rules, and I knew that every once in a while, like I really did have to swap in a different panel, but it felt like cheating a little bit. I mean, it was necessary ultimately. It's just a kind of ridiculous way to work. And, the process itself is called détournement. And it's French for sort of hijacking. And it was an approach to media that was started by sort of the left intellectuals in France in the 1960s, sort of culminating in those student riots of 68. And that technique was one that they used. And it ultimately became known kind of as culture jamming. I don't know if you've ever... No. When you see a billboard that like a McDonald's billboard, and then somebody has defaced it by sort of comically altering parts of it.
Yeah,
like
sure. It's almost
spirit,
like the very basic thing of adding a mustache to like an ad or something like that with a woman,
absolutely, yeah.
Pouring a coffee for her husband.
Yeah.
Right. Gotcha.
Or an eye patch, fangs.
Yeah. Now I'm a part of a handful of Facebook groups for various artists like Wallywood, etc. And I think there's even a Facebook group that just talks specifically about swiping, I think is what it's called.
Yeah.
And so there's an element of that, right? And can you explain a little bit about what that is?
Well,
so
swiping,
it's connected, right? It's connected.
Well, absolutely connected. Swiping actually has two sort of parts to it. One part is that prior to the internet, artists created what they called swipe files, and basically, you're an artist and you're drawing a comic, and you need you need an airplane. Well, you got to see what an airplane looks like in order to draw it.
Sure.
And there's no internet, so you have to have like a clipping
catalog,
of airplanes and aardvarks. Like literally. Comic book artists would have these filing cabinets just filled with what they called swipe files, right? And they would just, like Wally Wood said that, don't draw it if you can trace it.
Right.
He's got this list of start out like collage it if you can.
Sure. Okay.
And this is Wally Wood. I mean, Wally Wood drew the way I imagine Jesus would draw.
Oh my God. Just an unbelievable.
Yeah.
He's like the Leonardo da Vinci.
Guy, like an alcoholic Leonardo da Vinci. That guy suggested tracing.
Right.
Like that was his
that gives you ultimate permission at that point.
And so swiping. And then there's the other side of swiping, which is like I'm going to take that pose and that composition, and I'm going to use it on my cover. I found this great cover by somebody, and I'm going to use that too. And there's that Facebook group about swiping, like, oh, this person swiped from this person. So what? So fucking what?
Yeah.
Art is hard enough, right? Like swipe when you can, trace it if you can. And so, I've got a whole thing on swiping that I like to talk about. I mean, it's great, you can there's so many tremendous examples of the source material that artists use. I have this book on Ergay, the artist who did Tintin. And they published some of his swipe files in the book.
Oh, wow.
And then show side-by-side comparisons. Here's this panel with this boat.
Is it that really thick? It's a really thick. I have a really thick book of his okay, yeah.
No, it's a smaller. I'm not. He's got some questionable
ethics,
politics in his.
Yeah.
And so like
not exactly a feminist.
More anti-Semite.
All right.
But,
oh wow. Okay. Yeah.
But we can't just shut him out completely.
Yeah.
Like we still have to look at him.
Yeah.
And we can curse his name.
He's a fantastic
as we do
artist.
so.
I mean, I admire his artwork for sure.
He had a great team. A lot of the later books, he had his feet up, smoking his pipe in the corner.
Oh yeah.
Like he had he's revered in Europe, but
yep.
He's kind of Europe's Walt Disney. Walt didn't do a lot of his own work either.
It's interesting to hear that he was anti-Semitic, considering that there was a Tintin movie directed by Steven Spielberg.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Capitalism.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But let's get back to swiping though, because I want to hear what you had to say in terms of perhaps your own sort of favorability towards it. I mean, but you were about to roll into it. I want to hear a little bit more about that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know where I left off. I try to explain what I do in the book. So the back of Pinko Joe is a couple of pages where I lay out the process. There's photographs of the process. And then I list the artists that I swiped, the stories and the artists and the volume of the comic book or whatever, as much as I could find them. Artists in the 1950s were often not given any credit at all.
Right.
And so it's conjecture who did what. But, in my case, I mean, it's funny. I tell people I swipe stuff all the time, and it's like they don't hear me. I've just given up. On Instagram, like, oh, hey, I really dig your style. Like, thanks.
Right.
Like, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. That's interesting because, clearly you have a tremendous amount of background. You could draw all the stuff that I'm seing here for sure. So it's not like
it would just take me forever. It takes so long.
Well, see, this is the thing that I just I sent you a comic book that I worked on, right? And and it to finish that was amazing that I did that for me personally, but it was very painful. I admire the fact that you can sit here and write all of this stuff, let alone, go through the craft of it, right? I understand you didn't draw a lot of this stuff, but you still colored it, you inked it, you wrote it. So it's still incredibly time consuming. I understand that you're probably what your main motive here is to get ideas out, right? And then in addition to that, you're using it as a way to bring these other artists out that weren't talked about, weren't respected, forgotten artists. So I think it's a pretty amazing thing, but I can understand why, especially with how busy you are. I mean, you're constantly creating. I could see why you wouldn't want to sit here and draw 75 pages of this type of stuff, Well, it's the process of inking, I try to give credit to the original artist, but bringing this stuff back to life was arduous and painful. I had a little Post-it calendar, like a countdown, only 47 pages to go, and I put on a bunch of fucking weight, like sitting in that chair. It was, it felt like punishment. Yeah.
I got to go and serve time now. I got to sit on my ass for 12 hours as I ink this motherfucking page.
They need stand-up desks. They need stand-up desks for drafting tables.
So I mean the process of making it was I feel your pain. Like anybody who makes anything, nobody should give them any shit about it, right? Like you don't like it, don't consume it.
Right.
But keep your fucking mouth shut and give a little respect to somebody who made something.
Yeah.
And that's something I go through with my students. Like, I really once they make their first comic, like they have crossed a threshold and they are not allowed back across. You move from consumer to maker.
Yeah.
And that's a kind of holy threshold that most people never cross. Right? They say they want to cross it. Oh, I've got an idea for a comic book. Every time somebody says, I want you to draw a comic book, I've got a great idea, I run the other fucking way. Like, there is no way that I'm going to suffer for your fucking, like, you want to make a comic book, suck it up, learn how to draw.
Yeah.
It only takes about 10 years. Get in there. You want to make it.
Right. It's interesting. I think about a modern era version of a Wallywood would be somebody like Chris Ware in terms of sheer talent. Are you familiar with his work much at all, Chris Ware?
Yeah.
And, you see somebody with that much talent and how prolific he is, but he seems like he just lives this insufferable life. Like he just almost like hates his life to some degree. And when I listen to somebody like Daniel Clowes, it's almost similarly, like it just feels like they have this, it's almost like they can't help but produce, but there is definitely an element of lack of fun that seems to happen with these people who live lives of comic book artists. Do you get that sense as well? Or and do you see that changing now that you see the young budding artists coming across the lane now, or what? There's some people out there who are pretty joyless. That's too bad. Once the fucking book is done, I try to be happy about it and and joyful a little bit. I don't know that I don't know that I'll ever make another full-length comic book. Like right now, I'm enjoying doing the Instagram stuff, and that seems to people seem to be more interested in those than in the books anyway. And certainly a lot easier.
It's certainly a lot easier. I do one over coffee. I almost just did one right then. Like they're so quick to make, and I don't have to. There's no agony.
Yeah. Well, as we get closer to this hour here, a couple of questions before we start wrapping this up. I'm curious about social media is a really big way for you to get, to like you said, to kind of express yourself visually. How did you start to see that steam being picked up? Was that happening over a period of time, or was it one big thing that skyrocketed your, notoriety on Instagram?
Pandemic. The pandemic came and everything shut down. Right. All the cultural institutions. I've produced 4 hardbound books since the pandemic came about, and it's all just fallen on the floor. Right. Like it was a disaster.
Yeah.
Like. And so trapped at home, no venue. And then it was really seeing George Floyd being murdered. Like that was the straw that broke the camel's back.
Yeah.
Like I wasn't, with the pandemic, I wasn't going to go out there and protest. In retrospect, it was probably okay. Like just, with a little bit of management around people. But at the time, I didn't feel comfortable participating in those big demonstrations.
Sure.
And so I did what I could. I started making things on Instagram, and I was thinking about like the great political cartoons of the past, right? I was just really inspired by all of that. And so I just started posting. as my anger sort of ebbed and flowed around any particular topic, I began posting more and more, and it just sort of picked up. The combination of how I was making the drawings and what I was saying seemed to resonate, and my the Instagram kind of blew up. I mean, I don't think it's anywhere. I think it's a very healthy audience, but I still feel Instagram's boot on my neck, right? Like, I don't think they like what I'm posting, and so my stuff.
You ever get flagged or anything like that? Much. Oh, right.
Not flagged, but they definitely throttle my viewership. Because I'm not posting pictures of food and like beautiful fall foliage, and that's really what they want. Which is too bad. Somebody needs to invent an Instagram that's like old Instagram.
Yeah.
Which is just like, sort of democratic.
Yeah. I'm wondering if there's an opportunity for you to, because I feel like there is such an importance in what you're saying here, like having a platform in which this becomes more of a thing that people can use as a way to connect with others and hopefully bring people together to make change about certain topics that are really important. For example, you say you might not ever create another comic book, but I wonder if there's an opportunity where you could perhaps publish, the 2 years worth of work that you've created during the pandemic of very monumental moments in this, critical point of our, the history of humankind, right? I mean, have you considered that as a potential opportunity for you there?
Actually, in the third book of the Forced Collaboration Trilogy, is what I call it. I wanted to put some of those things from Instagram in. So the part of the last book is a parody of Mad Magazine, and in that parody of Mad Magazine, it's all these Instagram posts. It sounds weird, but nice. I think it works really well. I think it's very funny, and then it just all seemed to fit together really well. I don't know that I do these things daily. They're not all winners. Mm-hmm. A lot of them aren't very funny, which they should be.
Yeah.
But they're just kind of angry sometimes.
Right. Yeah, and that's okay. That's all right. I think people connect with it, even if it's not trying to make you laugh. I think that's totally fine. Okay, so as we wrap things up, I have a couple more questions, and then we're going to kick out of here. I believe you said in a video that I watched that you said every artist hopes to be remembered, and I was curious if there was you think about the tombstone, or the scenario where people are talking about you after you're gone. I mean, what is the thing that you hope, or the things that you hope that people will remember you by?
That's tough. I don't believe in an afterlife. Once I'm gone, I'm gone. That's it. I hope that it's not all been for nothing, but I don't know. Like there might be thermonuclear war next week. Like that's on the horizon here. We thought Trump was bad, and then we got COVID, and we thought COVID was bad, and now we got Putin. It's not looking hopeful. And then there's climate change, right? I hope that somebody finds my books and is able to burn them for heat on the sort of blasted desert floor as they're hunting for water and safety from the fallout.
Nice.
Post-apocalyptic.
Right. That's a great way to summarize that. There is one question I did have is, but now I had one specific question. But now that I know that you have such a wider range of who you would who your influences are and what your influences are. I was going to ask you if you had an evening where you could have a round table of 5 comic book artists, who would that be? But I'm not sure if maybe that's the right way. I mean, maybe if I would just say, who would the 5 people be that you would want to have a roundtable conversation with, who would that be?
Yeah, that's tough, that desert island stuff. Jack Kirby, I don't know if Jack had anything interesting to say about comics, right? Like that's my fear, is like meeting your heroes. Maybe
sorely disappointed.
Dicks.
Yeah.
Well, like Wally Wood drew like an angel, but by all accounts, he was, not a pleasant guy.
Yeah.
Like, would you want to have dinner with somebody who made great things, but was also just a narcissistic asshole?
Probably.
Like, really?
I say that probably because somebody who is, firstly, I've found that most of my heroes tend to be pretty awesome. Most of them tend to be humble. Most of them tend to be in awe of the community they're surrounded by. It's not to say that some of them aren't assholes, right? But I think for the most part, the biggest heroes that I've had in my life, whether they're drummers or artists, they tend to be they tend to live up to the expectation. If it turns out that they wind up being assholes, well, then that's, it's just part of life. And you say, wow, I guess that's just part of life, So I don't really, I would rather have that moment. Let me just say that, to make me have that full decision.
Well, so, I've had enough dinners with assholes that I don't need to have another dinner with assholes. I would rather not. And so directors and comic book artists, they may not be the best dinner companions. Maybe like Bridget Bardot. Like, I really admire her work in certain lights. And Sigourney Weaver, when, like
badass.
70s Sigourney Weaver.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Amazing.
Yeah.
Nice.
And, I don't know. Jack Kirby for sure, but I wouldn't expect much out of Jack because, he's a dude who sits in, he would draw up to 5 pages a day.
That's insane.
It's insane. So how can he be any good at conversation or anything else when he's, penciling, sitting on his ass penciling all day?
He's constantly probably shifting his eyes, looking at his drawing board, wanting to get back to work. Yeah. Well, awesome, man. Well, listen, it's been great talking to you, man. It's been great getting to know you a little bit more. If you could, why don't you tell everybody where they can find your work? Again, what's the next big project? I guess you have the book coming out, right? Yeah, I've got so the 3rd volume of the Forced Collaboration trilogy is coming out in X. There's supply chain. The fucking supply chain and the World War III is kind of, getting in the fucking way of my book coming out. Beyond that, I see making more drawings for Instagram, which is at pinko_Joe on Instagram. And please don't send me death threats. I get enough of those. If you don't like something, just stop following me. And if you want the books, you can get them from the publisher is Argle Bargle Books, and they're arglebarglebooks.com. And then the American distributor for the books is Rat Nest Sticker Co. Okay. But you can find all of this from my Instagram. If you get to my Instagram, you can get to everything. Great. Yeah, and we'll also put that in the description for when we announce the episode being launched on Instagram as well. So, Chris, it's been an absolute pleasure. Really appreciate getting you to pull away from your spring break time, and hopefully we can talk soon, okay? Yeah, great. Okay, man. Take care. Thank you. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for listening to the Pencil Pushers Podcast. Follow us on Instagram at the Pencil Pushers Podcast for visual representation of our guest artwork, topics discussed, and anything else that contributes to the show. So be sure to subscribe. Tell a friend. Tell lots and lots of friends. Become a leadhead. and we're out.